My dad used to be an abalone diver as a young man in Victoria. Easy money by the bag if you wanted it enough. Though half the guys that do it act like they're on cocaine most of the time from all the nitrogen in their blood. So it's a dangerous game you can only play for so long. There's a story he told me once, and only when he got drunk on his 50th, about an encounter he had whilst diving with a mate. The water down that part of Australia is thick and black and cold. The kelp is so thick that some people get lost in it and tangle their breather hose, or more often than you'd think, just disappear. Anyway, he's diving off a shelf face about 90 meters, and it's completely black. He said you would just pull yourself along the face, grabbing abalone by feel. The pressure is enormous, and there are great whites swimming around with their mouths open who regularly attack divers or cut air hoses, which, by the time you realize, you're dead. Well, without rambling, he was making his way along this shelf collecting, and felt a nudge on his back. His mate and him always worked in close tandem, so he just assumed it was him and reached out to pull him closer, but as soon as his hand touched it, it just smashed him out of the way and got its tail wrapped around the air hose, which ripped it off the container connected to my dad's mask. So he immediately got his little pin light out that he kept on his dive belt for checking cuts. He sees that the end of the hose is a few meters away, spewing bubbles. The thing that gave me chills is the way he described that in the inky darkness 90 meters down, he could see nothing but the reflection of the bubbles from the hose, and the dark, lifeless eye of the great white behind it. From what I can piece together from the odd story and anecdote, that was the last dive he ever did, recreational or commercial. He's never told anyone except me or one of his brothers, and I'd never dare to tell Mom. In my youth, I did a lot of things that I'm not very proud of today, but I wanted to see other parts of the world, and I knew that I did not have the discipline to be in the Navy. So I got jobs on various ships, working from one place to the next. I liked being out on the ocean quite a bit, but I also really liked visiting different places. However, when I was in Japan, I lost my job on one of the ships. I didn't have much money at the time, and nowhere to really stay in Japan. While I was stranded in Osaka, I was able to get a job on a ship. I wasn't really happy about it, though. I mean, the ship was sort of seedy. I don't want to tell you too much about what was going on, but I will let you know that it was a smuggling ship. The conditions on the ship were much different than the other ships I had worked on. The crew were the closest things to pirates that I could have imagined lived in that period of time. But the scariest person on the ship was the captain. He was a surly man who had only one arm. He had a scraggly beard, and it almost seemed like he never changed his clothing. I also think that he probably had read Treasure Island one too many times. He was very no-nonsense. He barked orders at people and didn't really seem to care too much for the people who worked for him. I mean, I guess in a way it made sense. The man was already deeply entrenched in a very illegal business, so I guess he was pretty much a god on his own ship. So, the most frightening thing that ever happened to me in my life happened when I was working on that ship. It was a time that made me realize exactly what sort of dangerous situation we were in, and not from the law or any government, from that man. 2 of the crew members had to make a repair on the ship. They were carrying a piece of sheet metal across the deck and carrying it in a very awkward manner, over their heads as opposed by the side. I was about to go over to them and offer some help, but before I had the chance to, though, the guy who was carrying it in the front slipped. He lost his grip on the piece of sheet metal and fell forward onto the deck. The guy in the back then naturally stumbled as well and lost his grip. The piece of sheet metal then slid forward and sliced into the neck of the crew member in the front, halfway decapitating him. The second crewman jumped back from the sheet metal, and his nearly decapitated partner began screaming as other crewmen came up to the scene. The captain then made his way on deck, obviously alerted by the commotion going on. He walked up to the 2 crewmen and looked down at them. The nearly decapitated man wasn't dead, though. He was convulsing and bleeding all over the place. The captain reached into his jacket and pulled out his revolver. He then shot the almost headless man twice, putting him out of his misery. When this happened, I immediately thought that the captain was being merciful. Could I possibly have been wrong about him? But while this thought was going through my head, something happened that brought me back to my original opinion of him. He took the gun, shot and killed the crew member who was carrying the back of the piece of sheet metal too. The man fell down dead. The captain made us clean up the bodies and take up the sheet metal to finish the repair. The entire rest of the trip to Hong Kong I was terrified. I mean, to think that this man was heartless enough to kill someone for making a mistake, I was walking on eggshells the entire time. When we got to the port, I decided I'd rather be stranded and homeless in Hong Kong than go back to that ship. I didn't feel safe until it left port. 15 years ago, I was on a 4-person dive. There were 2 novices, me with 80-ish dives, and the dive leader. We swam in a diamond shape, me bringing up the rear. But one of the novices was all over the place with a camera, burning through his air and swimming up a storm as it were. He lost grip on this shiny new camera and it zipped upwards, got caught in his snorkel, but he couldn't see it. So he kicked out hard for the surface, thinking, I assumed, to chase down his camera, and went right by me upwards. I grabbed his fin and hauled him down. I signaled to him to stop and calm down. I untangled his camera and handed it to him. Only he didn't move. Instead, his regulator fell out of his mouth, his eyes wide, but unresponsive. I stuffed his reg back in, and unsure what to do, looked for the dive master, but he was gone. For whatever reason, I couldn't reach my tank banger while holding on to the diver and his leg. I started to panic, so I decided to take him up quickly. He had epilepsy. I found this out at about 20 meters on our way up as he started to fit. He got caught up in my gear and kicked my inflator hose from my BCD, and I started venting air. I honestly don't remember much of the next minutes, but I do remember letting him go and watching him slipping below me as air bubbles from my inflator hose rushed upward. The next thing I do remember is this constant beeping noise from my wrist. It was a cheap dive computer, but it had a depth alarm, which roused me from my panic as I dipped past 35 meters. My inflator was back in my BCD and I still had air, but there was no one else around. I started swimming up slowly, in shock I think, when suddenly the dive leader went past me in a blast of current. He grabbed me as he went and hauled me up topside. I was relieved to see he had the epileptic novice diver in tow too. On the boat, they called up a rescue boat to come out and meet us. He was in decompression for a couple of days, I think, but he was fine. I know this because 4 days later, they caught him about to dive again at a different resort. I got air trapped in the pipe between my ear and throat, which was painful and gave us a scare, but ultimately I was fine. The year 2001 marked the 60th anniversary of the sinking of the British HMS Hood and the German battleship the Bismarck. But 1941 was a faithful year for countless other ships that were lost at sea, including the SS Britannia, on which I happened to be a passenger. At the beginning of 1941, I was in Cornwall working in a small team providing power for a new station for cable and wireless being built in 2 tunnels in Porthcurno. It was there that I was offered an extremely well-paying job that involved aiding in the construction of Tehran University, all the way over in Iran. So in March of that year, I left the team to begin the journey that would take me from Britain to Bombay in India, and then on to Basra in Iraq for the land journey to the Iranian capital. I had no idea that I would never make it that far. My wife saw me off from Euston Station in London. As there was a war on, I did not say I was embarking for Liverpool, as this would have clued her into the perilous nature of the voyage and worried her immensely. But she told me later that she saw it on the side of the train as I left. The SS Britannia was used as a troop ship, and there were a lot of Navy, Army, and RAF personnel on board. But luckily for me, I was a first-class passenger. We sailed from Liverpool on the 11th of March 1941, bound for India, via Sierra Leone and South Africa. We had an anti-submarine escort consisting of 3 destroyers and an armed merchant cruiser. The destroyers were stationed one ahead and one each to port and starboard of the convoy. The armed merchant cruiser was a large passenger liner that acted as our rear guard. I jotted down details of my journey, including my expenses, in a small diary that I still have. The ship rolled quite a lot to start with, and I was seasick for a few days. But once the sea had calmed down a bit, I found the voyage much more pleasant. Then one day, I found that the Britannia had become separated from its armed escorts. They were nowhere to be seen. But we all figured we were safe, as we thought that we were sailing too fast for the U-boats to catch up and attack. It was a Tuesday morning, the 25th of March, 1941. I had just taken a morning bath and was lying on my bunk, trying to cool down. Never had I ventured outside of England before, and I must admit I was having a terrible time adjusting to the heat. Suddenly, a series of huge booming sounds shattered the tranquility of the morning at sea. I looked out my porthole, and splashes in the water were everywhere. Something was falling into the water around the ship. I threw some clothes on quickly and made my way over to the starboard side. That's when I heard the tannoy announcement. A voice echoed around the ship from the small, tiny speakers located on each deck. I'll never forget how terrified I was when I had heard we had come under attack from a German raiding vessel. My fellow passengers were panicking as the military personnel on board began to rush into action, screaming at us to take cover away from the outward-facing bulkheads. As we cowered under tables and prayed for our safety, we could hear the whistling of enemy shells as they flew over the ship. It was a sound I still hear in my nightmares. Our civilian liner had been reinforced with a small gun at the rear of the ship, and it brought us hope to hear them returning fire for a moment. But when the ship rocked under the force of a direct hit, our gun fired no more. We later heard that they had taken full force of the incoming shell, with the entire gun crew killed in an instant. I can remember one specific officer, Officer Rowlinson, racing to and fro, carrying the wounded to the first aid post, with more and more blood staining his uniform with every trip he made. I thought very highly of that man. After another devastating hit from the German warship, there was another announcement over the ship's tannoy, ordering us to abandon ship. We found some of the lifeboats damaged when we arrived on deck, which was very worrying, but we still managed to find one intact boat on the starboard aft. I inflated my life jacket, threw my overcoat from the lifeboat, then climbed down and got in. In theory, it was supposed to be women first, followed by first-class passengers. In reality, it was every man for himself. There were too many people climbing down the ladder, and some of the crew were jumping overboard. We were forced to lower the lifeboat early to prevent it being dragged down with the sinking vessel, so many of the crew had to climb down the ropes to reach safety. Some slipped and scorched their hands, causing horrific blistering to their palms and fingers. 2 men were still climbing down the rope as we began to push the lifeboat away from the burning ship. The terror in their eyes was something I'll never forget. They must have thought that they were doomed. All the occupants of the lifeboat called out to them to jump into the water and swim to us. Thank God we waited for them, as one of the men was a Sri Lankan doctor by the name of Das Gupta. May God bless him, for he treated the injured as best as he could. As we rowed away from the burning wreck of the Britannia, we watched as the German raiding ship closed in for the kill. She was flying the swastika, and my heart burned with hatred as she fired shells below the waterline and sent the Britannia to the bottom of the ocean. After 2 days at sea, we found a waterlogged boat with 4 men in it. It suddenly tipped over and they managed to turn it over again and got back in. This happened 2 or 3 more times, and the commander finally agreed to take them on board. The days at sea did affect some people. After a few days, one man put on his overcoat and threw himself overboard. He had lost his mind from the stress of the whole affair. The commander did turn around and pick him up, but it was too late. His heavy clothing had dragged him down into the briny depths. We had sharks with us virtually all the time. They could smell the blood from the wounded and circled us with their fins protruding from the water. It was nerve-wracking. They swam right up next to the boat often, and sometimes I could see their dead eyes staring up at us as they did. It was horrible thinking that certain death was only a few feet away at any given moment. After a few days without washing or access to toilets, 1 or 2 people suggested that we have to swim. They put oars across to hold onto, and a couple at a time went over. We were told to be alert, and looking back, we must have been mad. I went in, but I didn't swim. As soon as I did so, we were scared by a pod of whales which had these great whacking fins. The sharks were the worst, but the sheer size of these whales was something to behold. They could have smashed our lifeboats to smithereens with one flick of their tails. I learned later that Officer Rowlinson was picked up off a raft by the Cabo de Hornos, a Spanish vessel, and he and a French baroness who was a passenger persuaded the captain to continue searching. On Saturday the 29th of March, we saw the Cabo de Hornos lit up and put up a flare that was spotted by a lookout. We rowed towards the ship, which in turn made for our original position. When we met up, the lifeboat was going up and down with the swell. We climbed the rope ladder, but we flopped when we got on the deck and had to be carried to tables. We really needed some water as it had been greatly rationed in the lifeboat. They then came around with sandwiches, but took them away when we had one each. It took a week or so to recover from that experience, which was the worst of the war for me. But I thank God every single day that I survived, as there were many poor souls who did not. I like the fog. I always have, but the fog that I like is the fog on land, not on the ocean. There's little more scary and confusing than a thick fog when you're out at sea. I have a boat that I like to take out on the ocean as often as I can. It's a small boat, but it's got a kitchen, small dining family room, and cots to sleep on. Very often, me and a couple of my friends will go out and spend some time on the ocean. Although I have always kept very close watch on the weather can always be unpredictable. We had been out for a couple of nights and I made a really foolish navigation error. I really hadn't realized it at the time because we were having some beer and I was just trying to relax. But one of my buddies noticed something and pointed it out to me. I turned and looked and was immediately alarmed. We were moving towards what appeared to be really thick fog, or more likely, it was also moving towards us, and very quickly. Now this is where my complete stupidity kicked in. I had never actually been through a fog on the ocean before. I actually like when it's foggy on land, like I said. There's something about the creepiness of the atmosphere, especially when it's really thick. My friends, being as stupid as I was, thought it would be quite the adventure to steer into the fog and see what it was like. I'd like to think that if we were all sober at the time, then perhaps we wouldn't have considered doing something so foolish. As we approached the major block of fog, we began seeing smaller wafts of fog rising off the ocean. It was really very eerie. The fog got thicker and thicker as we got more into the fog bank. Soon, we couldn't really see anything that well. We turned out all the lights, except for, of course, the starboard and port navigation lights, which don't turn off. It was drunken stupidity, but it was pretty cool too. It did end up getting a little less cool, however, when we got lost in that fog. I mean, I had my GPS, so I wouldn't be lost out on the ocean, but that didn't tell me how big the fog was and what we had to do in order to get out of it. As more time passed, even though we were still clearly intoxicated, the coolness of our expedition gave way to some nervousness. We tried turning some lights back on at one point, but if you know anything about fog, that doesn't help too much. After a while, we saw something in the fog. It was hard to make out, but there was definitely something there. I immediately thought that another boat was out there too, so I decided I should go and ring my foghorn. I went and did this several times to warn the other ship that I was there in case it didn't see me. I waited to see if I would get a response, but I didn't. So I blew the horn again in case they didn't hear us. After trying this for a few times and not getting any sound or any response at all, we thought about the possibility of the ship being adrift. We really thought about taking a closer look, but we were not drunk enough that we didn't consider the dangers of getting too close to an adrift boat. So we did our best to keep our distance, but tried to get close enough that we could hopefully see something. When we were passing the boat, one of my drunk buddies decided he wanted to try something stupid. He went into the cabin and came back with a golf ball. We had played golf before our trip. I knew what he was going to do immediately and tried to stop him. However, it didn't work as he took the golf ball and hurled it at the other boat. We all heard the clanging noise as the ball hit the hull. And then, lights came on in the boat. After moments, 3 men came onto the deck, all holding guns, and they aimed right at us. We needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. A few shots rang out, though, before I was able to get into the controls and pick things up. I thought we were going to get away easy, since my boat was obviously much newer and a faster model than what they had. Plus, I really doubted they would come after us, but I was wrong. They did try to come after us. All I could figure to do at that point was to try to use the fog to our advantage. I turned the lights back out. It was dangerous navigating like before, but even more dangerous now that I was going much faster. But I had to do what I had to do, because I was convinced that those 3 men wanted to kill us. After about an hour, I was positive that we had lost them. However, I was too terrified to turn the lights back on right away. When I eventually did, I was very scared until we were able to get out of the fog. Sometimes something that might seem adventurous is just plain dumb. I was on a barquentine sailing vessel a few years back off the coast of Puerto Rico in the middle of a nasty storm. We were dousing our sails when things began to look calm for a second. People were going to rack out when we suddenly heard a meaty smack against the side of the ship. Somebody had fallen from the rigging and hit their leg on the gunwale, and then into the water they went. Swells were only 5 to 7 feet, but well enough to conceal a man overboard. The night was also pitch black, except for on occasion there was this bright blue lightning. Every few minutes it would give just enough illumination to see past the rain and wind. It was so hard to see where this guy was, even with the binoculars, man overboard modules, or whatever else we could throw that floats and lights up. An emergency small boat was sent out to bring him in, but couldn't find him either. As 12 minutes had passed without laying eyes on him, it wasn't looking good. Just a split second later, the lightning gives off the biggest spark and crack of thunder all night. The whole area was lit like a floodlight, with the light that shined above us, and there was our missing man. When the light was gone, the boat and the man overboard called out to each other. He got out of the water safely. I don't know if this incident qualifies as supernatural or divine intervention, but without that final burst of lightning, we would have never found our man out there. The night could have ended a lot grimmer, but he left that disaster with only a broken femur. Still, I think it's amazing the man tread water with a broken leg for 12 minutes in the middle of a storm. I'll never forget that. It's not about what I saw, but about what I heard. I was on a 688I second flight class boat for part of my career in the US Navy. We were heading from Hawaii to Japan and moving fast, so you tend not to see a whole lot on a sonar because of flow noise unless you're close. SAWS, or Situational Awareness Systems, reported a transient sound and said it was weird, but there was no trace on the screen, so it wasn't a distant source. It was all around us. I switched my station over to broadband, so I could see and hear what SAWS was saying and hearing, and started listening. Sure enough, I heard it too. It was a sound like crystal bells ringing with no defined source, except I had more sensors at my disposal because I could flip through any configuration. The sounds, whatever they were deeper than we were, and were all around us by the end of it. I still don't know what it was, but we always called them the Deep Ones in reference to Cthulhu. It was the type of thing that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up to listen to, though. I was in one of the deadliest hunter-killers powered by a nuclear reactor, and that kind of sound made you imagine something much bigger out there in the depths. This was really the creepiest thing I have ever had happen to me in my entire life. I come from a really long line of ocean fishermen, and of course, with overfishing it gets harder and harder all the time to really make a great living off of this. Yearly, it seems like I have to go further and further out into the ocean in order to get anything I can actually sell. It's definitely difficult having a smaller boat and competing with larger commercial boats, but I really love the life, and I'm not really willing to change my livelihood just because it gets more difficult. Anyway, I did have this really bizarre experience once when I was out fishing. We had been out for a couple of days and not doing the best job. We went out further and further. On the third night, we had gone out pretty far on the ocean. We hadn't seen any other boats or ships in quite a while, which I hoped was a good thing. Maybe we'd get lucky and be able to farm the area that wasn't getting too much attention from other ships. As night fell, the ocean was really, really calm. I was getting ready to get a little sleep when one of my shipmates came into the cabin and told me that there was a ship out ahead of us. It was coming right in our direction. Now, I wasn't really exactly sure why he felt the need to tell me this. Being out on a boat in the ocean isn't like being in a movie. We weren't really in any danger of being hit by the ship. We'd just move out of the way. But he insisted that I had to see the ship. I ended up going out on deck, and when I did, I understood immediately why he wanted me to come out and look. The ship was a cruise ship, but it wasn't like any cruise ship that would still be in service. The ship looked like it had to be at least 60 or 70 years out of date. There were no lights either. If we hadn't had a full moon, we would have had a much more difficult time seeing it in the first place. I was curious at this point. We tried to contact them on radio, but we weren't getting any response. We weren't in a direct line of the ship, but I definitely wanted to see the ship as it passed by, so we got as close as we could get safely to the ship. When I got closer, I noticed it was obviously adrift, so we had to be extra careful. When the ship was pretty close to us, it was quite overwhelming. It was so large, but it was ominous and dark and dead. There were no lights on it, and this was obviously a ghost ship. Keeping in mind that I am not referring to an actual ghost ship. I meant that the ship was abandoned, and who knew how long it could have been adrift. If you've ever been in a small boat next to a huge ship, it would be hard for you to imagine what it was like. It was ominous, and completely and utterly dwarfed our boat. If we had gotten too close to it, it would have easily destroyed us. We were like mice at the feet of a giant. "Holy shit," one of my friends said to me. I looked over at him and he pointed at the ship's deck. I was shocked to see someone on deck. A very young man, looked like he was in his early 20s. He was leaning over the rail looking at us. As we went along, he simply looked at us as we floated past. I tried calling out to the guy, but I got no response. He He just stood there, looking down at us. We turned around to get another look at him when we passed by, but he wasn't there the second time. We eventually went on after this amazing spectacle, but it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. We reported this all to the Coast Guard, but I honestly think that they thought it was a prank. I can't blame them. I would have thought it was a prank too.